The mead in Sadie's cup had gone warm, but she kept her fingers wrapped around it anyway, because a hand that held something had a reason to stay still. The great hall of Scarholt blazed with firelight, smoke curling toward the rafters where old shields hung blackened with age. Laughter rose and fell in waves around her. Warriors boasting of summer raids, women trading gossip behind painted fans of bone and lace, children weaving between long tables stacked with roasted boar and bread still steaming from the ovens. Sadie sat near the farthest wall, half swallowed by shadow, and told herself this was where she belonged now. Unseen, unimportant, forgotten by choice rather than cruelty. It hadn't always been that way. A year ago she had sat near the high table, beside a man who called her beloved in front of the whole hall. Henrik, her betrothed, heir to a minor jarl's seat, had promised her a future built on furs and gold and children who would never know hunger. She had believed every word, the way a person believes the sun will rise, not because they've examined the proof, but because the alternative is unthinkable. Then, 3 nights passed, she had gone looking for him after the evening meal, and found him instead in the shadow of the armory, speaking low with his stepmother, Gunhild, a woman whose smile had always reminded Sadie of a blade wrapped in silk. "The girl's pack blood is thin," Gunhild had said. "Once she's bonded fully, once the lands transfer under her name, it changes nothing for us. A wife who can't shift worth a damn is no threat. Marry her, take the inheritance, and when the time comes, the accident in the fjord will look like grief took her too far from shore." Sadie had not moved. She had not breathed. She had stood in the dark with her heart cracking open like river ice in spring, and she had listened to Henrik, her Henrik, laugh softly and say, "She trusts me. That's the only blessing in this." She had not told anyone. Who was there to tell? Her father was 3 winters in his grave. Her mother had died birthing her, leaving Sadie with nothing but a wolf that had never once shifted, a weakness whispered about since childhood, a shame the pack elders called broken-blooded. Without a true wolf inside her, she had no voice in council, no protection beyond what a husband or father could grant. And the only father she'd ever truly had, the old Jarl, Henrik's own sire, had died believing his son loved her. So she had smiled at supper that night. She had let Henrik kiss her temple, and she had begun, quietly, to plan. Tonight's feast, the midwinter gathering, when jarls and chieftains from every fjord came together to trade, to feud, to arrange marriages and settle blood debts, was her chance. Hundreds of strangers filled Scarholt's hall. In such a crowd, a woman could disappear. She intended to slip away before the betrothal contracts were signed at midnight, vanish into the dark hills, and pray the wilderness was kinder than the wedding bed waiting for her. She had not counted on him. The hall's heavy doors groaned open, and the noise didn't stop so much as change, voices dropping not from fear exactly, but from the particular hush that comes when something vast enters a room. Sadie felt it before she looked, a pressure against her skin, like the moment before lightning, like standing too close to a hearth fire built for giants. She looked up. He stood in the doorway with snow still melting in his dark hair, a fur mantle thrown back from broad shoulders, and eyes the pale gray of a wolf moon. He did not announce himself. He didn't need to. Every jarl in the hall rose halfway from their benches, and Sadie heard the name pass table to table like a current under ice. Leander, the AlphaKing, ruler of the northern packs, blood-sworn protector of every territory from the Black Cliffs to the frozen straits, a man whose wolf was said to be larger than any born in 300 years. He came to midwinter gatherings perhaps once a decade, when matters of succession or war demanded his presence. His arrival meant something significant was about to happen. A marriage of consequence, a judgment, a war declared or ended. Sadie shrank further into the shadow of the wall, pulling her shawl higher. The last thing her plan needed was the attention of kings. But his eyes moved through the hall with an unhurried, terrible precision, passing over jarls bowing their heads, over women angling themselves into the light, over warriors trying not to look as though they were watching him at all, and stopped. On her. Sadie's breath caught. For one absurd moment she thought she'd imagined it, that surely a man like that could have no reason to look twice at a broken-blooded girl folded into the dark like a forgotten coat. But his gaze didn't move on. It held, steady as a held knife, and something in his expression shifted. Not surprise, she realized with a chill crawling up her spine. Relief, as though he had been searching for her specifically. As though he had crossed half the northern world expecting to find exactly this face in exactly this shadow. He began walking toward her, and the entire hall turned to watch him do it. And Sadie understood, with the sick lurch of a woman realizing the ice beneath her has already cracked, that whatever she had planned for tonight, it was no longer hers to control. Sadie. Henrik's voice cut in from somewhere to her left. Too quick. Too bright. Stand, love. The AlphaKing is... She did not look at Henrik. She could not look away from the man approaching, broad and silent, and utterly unlike anyone she had ever stood near. His presence pulling at something low and unfamiliar in her chest. Something her never-shifted wolf stirred toward like a candle flame leaning into wind. He stopped before her table. Up close, the gray of his eyes had flecks of something darker, like storm clouds over a winter sea, and the scar along his jaw spoke of violence survived rather than violence sought. "Forgive the interruption," he said, and his voice was low, controlled, made for command rather than charm. "I have traveled 3 days through snow to find this hall. I did not expect to find what I was looking for so quickly." Sadie's mouth had gone dry. "My lord, I don't believe we've met." "We haven't." Something flickered behind his eyes, not quite a smile. "But I would know your scent anywhere now that I've found it. You are Sadie, daughter of Eric, of the Western Shore Pack." It was not a question. The hall had gone fully silent now, every eye fixed on the spectacle of the AlphaKing kneeling on one knee before a woman the pack elders called broken-blooded, a woman whose own betrothed had gone rigid with shock 3 paces away. "I am," she whispered. "Then I have come," Leander said, "because the moon marked you as mine 7 months ago, the night your father died beneath my protection on contested ground. I have spent every day since searching the northern fjords for the woman my wolf would not let me forget." Somewhere behind her, Sadie heard Gunhild's sharp intake of breath, heard Henrik's chair scrape back as he rose too fast, his face draining of color. She heard none of it clearly. The only thing she could hear was her own pulse, and beneath it, impossibly, something inside her chest answering a call she had never known she was capable of hearing. The hall did not return to its noise so much as fracture into 100 separate whispers, all of them about her. Sadie stared down at the AlphaKing still kneeling before her, the firelight catching the silver threading through his dark hair at the temples, and tried to find words that would not betray how thoroughly her world had just tilted sideways. Mate. The word sat in her mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every certainty she'd built her life upon. She had no wolf. She had never shifted. The pack healers had examined her as a girl and pronounced her broken-blooded, incapable of the bond, incapable of ever being chosen by anyone's true mate sense. It was the reason Henrik's family had considered her safe to marry, a woman who could never claim a mate right that might complicate inheritance, never call upon pack law to protect what was hers. And yet this man, this king who commanded wolves the size of horses, whose name alone made jarls lower their eyes, knelt before her as though she were something sacred. "You're mistaken," she heard herself say, low enough that only he and those nearest could catch it. "I have no wolf, my lord. Whatever you scented, it cannot be a true bond." Something passed behind his gray eyes. Not doubt, but a kind of patient certainty. The look of a man who had already considered every objection she might raise and found none of them sufficient. "The healers who examined you," he said quietly, "were pack healers loyal to your betrothed's family. Tell me, Sadie, did they ever once let you near open water during a full moon? Did they ever test you beyond a single failed attempt as a child?" She opened her mouth, closed it. The truth was that no, they hadn't. One failed shifting at 11 years old, blood drawn from her palm and pressed to silver. No reaction. And from that day forward, she had been catalogued as broken. The matter never revisited. "That is not proof of brokenness," Leander said. "That is proof of a girl tested once, by people who had every reason to want her tested wrong." Behind her, Henrik found his voice at last, sharp with a panic he was trying badly to disguise as outrage. "My lord, with respect, Sadie is betrothed to me. The contracts are nearly signed. Whatever your wolf senses, surely it cannot override a binding agreement made in good faith before witnesses." Leander rose to his full height then, and the movement alone seemed to suck the warmth from the air around them. He did not look at Henrik the way a king looks at a lesser jarl's heir. He looked at him the way a wolf looks at something it has already decided is beneath concern. "Good faith," Leander repeated, and the words came out edged with something cold enough to make the nearest torches seem to gutter. "I wonder, boy, how good your faith has been. Mate bonds do not form across betrothals lightly entered. The moon does not mark a woman already promised in love and safety to another. It marks her when there is something she needs protection from." Sadie's heart stopped. He couldn't know. He couldn't possibly know what she'd overheard in the armory shadows 3 nights past. And yet the way his eyes flicked briefly to Gunhild, standing rigid and pale near the high table, made something cold uncoil in Sadie's stomach, as if he'd already scented the rot in this hall before he ever crossed its threshold. "This is not the place," Henrik said quickly, too quickly, "for accusations, my lord. We can discuss the matter of the bond privately, but the betrothal stands—" "The betrothal," Leander said, "stands only as long as the woman wishes it to." Every eye in the hall turned to Sadie. She had spent 3 days planning her escape into the hills, certain that the only freedom available to a broken-blooded woman was the freedom to vanish quietly before anyone noticed she was gone. She had never once imagined a version of tonight where someone offered her a different door, one she might walk through standing upright instead of crawling out a window in the dark. But trust did not come easily to a woman who had just learned, 3 nights ago, that the man she loved had been counting down to her murder. "I need time," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I need time to think, my lord. Forgive me, but I do not know you. I knew Henrik for 2 years, and I did not know him at all in the end. I will not simply trade one man's claim for another's because the moon willed it." Something shifted in Leander's expression. Surprise, she thought, quickly smoothed into something gentler, almost approving. Most women, she suspected, did not refuse an Alpha King in front of a packed hall. "That," he said, "is the wisest thing anyone has said to me in 3 days of travel." He extended a hand, not grasping, not commanding, simply offered, palm up, the way one might offer a hand to someone standing at the edge of unsteady ice. "Then let me earn the trust I'm asking for. Walk with me, not as my mate, as a woman owed answers." Sadie looked at his hand. She looked past him at Henrik, whose face had gone the gray-white of old snow, at Gunhild, whose composure had finally cracked into something close to fear. She thought of the armory shadows, of the words the accident in the fjord, of a wedding bed she had been planning to flee tonight regardless of what any king willed. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm, careful, deliberately gentle in a way that felt almost like restraint, as though he were holding back a strength that could have crushed stone. The moment their skin touched, something flared low in Sadie's chest, a warmth spreading outward like sunlight breaking through winter cloud. And for one disorienting instant, she felt something stir beneath her skin too. Something that had slept so long she'd forgotten it could wake. She gasped, soft enough that only he heard it, and saw understanding bloom in his gray eyes. "There," he said quietly, for her alone. "Broken-blooded. They were wrong about you, Sadie. Your wolf isn't gone. She's been sleeping, waiting for something worth waking for." He led her toward the hall's side doors, away from the staring crowd, away from Henrik's stammering protests and Gunhild's narrowed eyes, out into an antechamber lit by a single iron brazier, where the noise of the feast became a distant murmur through thick timber walls. Furs lined a bench near the fire. The cold winter air still clung to his cloak, smelling of pine and frost, and something underneath that was entirely his own. Wood smoke and leather, and a wildness she had no name for. "Tell me what happened 3 nights ago," he said, once the door had closed behind them. "Tell me what you overheard, Sadie, because I did not travel through a blizzard chasing a mate bond for sport. I came because 3 days ago, my own wolf woke me from sleep with a certainty that someone under my protection's reach was in danger, and I do not believe, now that I've stood in that hall, that the danger was a coincidence." Sadie's hands had begun to tremble, the warmth of the antechamber finally letting the cold she'd been holding inside her chest break loose. She thought of Gunhild's voice in the dark, of the word accident, of a fjord that would have swallowed her in spring with no one left to ask questions. "They mean to kill me," she said, and saying it aloud for the first time made it unbearably real. "After the wedding, after the land's transfer to Henrik's name, Gunhild called it an accident in the fjord. Henrik agreed to it." Leander's jaw tightened, the only outward sign of the fury she sensed coiling beneath his calm. "Then it is fortunate," he said quietly, "that the moon marked you before they could finish their plan." The fire in the antechamber had burned low by the time Sadie finished speaking, her voice raw from words she had carried alone for 3 days. She had told him everything: the armory shadows, Gunhild's cold calculations, Henrik's laugh, the casual cruelty of the only blessing in this. Leander had not interrupted once. He had simply listened, standing near the brazier with his arms crossed, his expression carved from something harder than the stone walls around them, until she finished, and the silence stretched long enough that she began to wonder if she'd said too much, too fast, to a stranger she'd known less than an hour. "You believe me," she said finally, because his silence unsettled her more than questions would have. "I believe you," Leander said, "because I have spent 20 years learning to tell truth from performance, and what you just gave me was not performance. It cost you something to say it. Lies rarely do." He turned to face her fully. "But belief is not enough. I need proof that will hold before a council of Jarls, or Henrik's family will simply call you a jealous woman inventing slander against the man who scorned her for a king." The unfairness of it struck her like a slap, that even now, even with the truth sitting plain between them, the burden would fall on her to prove she hadn't imagined her own murder. "I have no proof," she said. "I have only what I heard. Then we find proof." His voice carried the same calm authority he'd used to silence Henrik in the hall, but something in his eyes had softened toward her, the storm gray settling into something steadier. "Gunhild does not plan an inheritance theft alone. Someone drafted those transfer documents. Someone witnessed them. Someone in that fjord village has already been paid, or promised payment, for an accident that hasn't happened yet. These things leave traces, Sadie, if you know where to look. And you know where to look? I have ruled long enough to know exactly where men hide their greed." A ghost of something that wasn't quite a smile touched his mouth. "Give me 3 days. Stay here, under my protection, and let me find what Gunhild and Henrik think they've hidden well enough. 3 days under the protection of an AlphaKing, instead of 3 days fleeing barefoot through frozen hills with nothing but a stolen cloak and desperate hope." Sadie should have felt relief. Instead, She felt the familiar, cold suspicion that had kept her alive this long. The same instinct that had saved her in the armory shadows. "Why?" she asked. "Why would the AlphaKing trouble himself with a broken-blooded woman's inheritance dispute? You could have 100 women across the north with stronger blood, stronger packs, stronger claims to offer you. Why fight for me?" Leander was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had lost some of its command, settling into something raw. "7 months ago, your father died protecting a border patrol of mine from a raiding party that should never have reached that deep into contested land. He fought when he didn't have to. He bought my men time to retreat with their lives, and he paid for it with his own. I have carried that debt since the day I learned whose daughter survived him." He paused. "Then 3 nights ago, my wolf woke me with a certainty I'd never felt before. That somewhere in this kingdom, a woman I hadn't yet met was about to be discarded by people who should have protected her. I did not know, until I walked into that hall tonight, that the debt and the bond were the same woman." Sadie's breath caught. She had not known, had never been told, the details of how her father died, only that he had fallen on contested ground, his body brought home wrapped in furs that smelled of someone else's territory. To hear that his death had bought safety for strangers, that it had somehow led an AlphaKing to her door 7 months later, felt like a thread pulling 2 separate griefs into one unbearable knot. "He never told me he served under your protection," she whispered. "He didn't serve under me. He served beside me, for one bitter winter, when our territories shared an enemy." Leander's eyes held hers. "He spoke of you, Sadie. Said his daughter had more steel in her than half his warriors, broken-blooded or not. I did not understand what he meant until tonight, watching you refuse a king in front of a packed hall rather than trade one cage for another." Something in her chest cracked open, not from fear this time, but from a grief so old and unattended it nearly buckled her knees. No one had spoken of her father to her like that in 7 months. No one in Henrik's household had bothered to remember him as anything but a useful dead man whose death had freed up land for negotiation. "I won't simply hide behind your walls while you fight my battle for me," she said, blinking back the burn behind her eyes. "If there's proof to find, I want a part in finding it. I know that household. I know which servants Gunhild trusts and which ones fear her. I know where Henrik keeps correspondence he thinks no one reads." For the first time since he'd walked through the hall doors, Leander's expression shifted into something close to genuine surprise, followed swiftly by approval that warmed his entire face. "Your father was right about the steel," he said. "Very well, we do this together. But you do nothing alone, Sadie. Not until Gunhild and Henrik no longer have the power to silence you the way they intended to." She nodded, and for the first time in 3 days, the tight coil of fear in her chest loosened enough to let her breathe fully. They spent the following hour mapping what they knew between them, Leander summoning a quiet, sharp-eyed woman named Brynja, one of his most trusted trackers, who listened to Sadie's account with narrowed eyes and a notebook of cured hide already filling with names. Servants who might be persuaded to speak. A scribe in the village who handled land transfer documents and had recently purchased a new horse he couldn't easily afford. A fisherman whose boat had been seen near the fjord cliffs more than once in recent weeks, asking questions about currents and timing that had nothing to do with fishing. By the time the brazier had burned down to embers, a plan had taken shape. Careful, patient, built to withstand scrutiny rather than collapse under it. Sadie would return to Henrik's household as though nothing had changed, giving no sign that she suspected anything beyond reasonable hesitation about a sudden royal claim. Brynja would work the village discreetly. Leander would remain nearby, close enough to act, far enough not to spook anyone into destroying evidence. "It's dangerous," Leander said quietly, when the others had stepped out to prepare horses for the ride back toward Henrik's lands at first light. "Returning there, if they suspect you know..." I've survived in that house for 2 years pretending I didn't see the truth of it, Sadie said. I can survive a few more days. He studied her for a long moment, firelight catching the intensity in his gray eyes, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with mate bonds or moon marks. Something quieter, more dangerous in its own way. Trust, beginning to take root where she had least expected to find it. 3 days, he said. Then I come for you, proof in hand, and Gunhild and Henrik answer for what they planned, before every Jarl gathered in that hall. And if you find nothing, then I will still come for you, Leander said simply, because I do not leave what is mine to die in a fjord for the sake of someone else's greed. The words should have frightened her, the casual certainty of mine, the assumption of claim before she'd offered it. Instead, standing in the dying firelight with her father's memory wrapped warm around her chest for the first time in months, Sadie found she did not mind the sound of it nearly as much as she once would have. The household had not changed in 3 days, but Sadie had. She moved through the familiar halls of Henrik's home with her shawl drawn close and her expression carefully arranged into the same quiet compliance she'd worn for 2 years. But beneath it now ran something steadier, a current of purpose that hadn't existed before the midwinter gathering. She greeted servants by name. She noticed for the first time the way the cook's young daughter flinched whenever Gunhild's voice carried down the hall, the way the stable boy avoided meeting anyone's eyes after dusk. She had spent 2 years as a ghost in this house, careful not to be noticed. Now she watched, and the watching revealed things she had never let herself see before. Henrik, for his part, treated her with a brittle, overcompensating warmth that fooled no one, least of all her. He brought her honeyed bread she hadn't asked for. He apologized, unprompted, for the scene at the feast, calling Leander's claim an old king's fancy, and assuring her the betrothal would proceed exactly as planned, as though saying it firmly enough might make it true. "You've been quiet," he said on the second evening, finding her in the small library off the great hall, where she'd taken to sitting with a book she wasn't reading. "Are you still troubled by what the AlphaKing said?" "I'm thinking," Sadie said, which was true enough. "There's nothing to think about." Henrik's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We've built a life together, Sadie. 2 years of plans. You don't throw that away because a stranger claims a moon bond at a feast." She studied him, really studied him, the way she hadn't allowed herself to in months, searching his familiar face for the man she'd once loved, and finding instead a stranger wearing his features. "Did you ever love me, Henrik? Or was I simply convenient? A quiet wife with no pack voice of her own, easy to manage, easy to discard when the lands were finally yours?" Something flickered across his face. Not guilt, she realized with a cold ache, but irritation that she'd asked at all. "Where is this coming from?" "Answer the question. You're being dramatic." He stood, smoothing his tunic, suddenly eager to end the conversation. "I have business with my stepmother. We'll speak more when you're being reasonable." He left without waiting for her reply, and Sadie sat alone in the library with her unread book, hands trembling not from fear this time, but from something closer to clarity. She had her answer. She had always had her answer, since the armory shadows 3 nights before the feast. She had simply needed to hear him refuse to deny it. That night, Brynja found her in the kitchen garden under cover of darkness, moving like a shadow herself, her face grim with purpose. "We have the scribe," Brynja said without preamble, "a man named Olav. He drafted the inheritance transfer documents 6 weeks ago. Documents that don't simply give Henrik control of your father's lands upon marriage, as the official contract states. There's a second clause, hidden in the language, that transfers everything fully and irrevocably to Henrik alone, with no provision for you whatsoever, should anything happen to you within the first year of marriage. No widow's portion, no claim, as though you were never meant to live past the wedding season." Sadie's stomach turned to ice. To see the proof laid bare, to know with cold legal certainty rather than overheard fragments, was a different kind of horror entirely. Will he testify? He's frightened, but Leander has offered him protection and coin enough to start fresh in another territory. He'll speak before the council if it comes to that. Brynja's eyes were sharp in the moonlight. There's more. The fisherman, Tormund, has been paid twice already by Gunhild's man, with a final payment promised upon completion of what he called the spring task. He kept the coin pouches. Stupid of him, but useful for us. He's agreed to surrender them as evidence. And Gunhild herself? Careful. Far more careful than her stepson. But careful people still leave traces. And we found one. A letter, half burned in her hearth, that survived enough to read the closing lines. She wrote to a kinsman in the Eastern Territories, boasting that the broken girl's lands will finally serve the family properly once the formalities conclude. Brynja produced a charred fragment of parchment from beneath her cloak, handling it with the reverence of something precious. It isn't a confession to murder outright. But paired with the documents and the fisherman's testimony, it paints a picture no council could dismiss as a jealous woman's invention. Sadie held the fragment with hands that didn't shake nearly as much as she expected them to. 3 days ago, she had been planning to flee into the hills with nothing. Now she held, however small and burned, the beginning of justice. Leander wants you brought to him tonight, Brynja said. He says the proof is enough to act, but he won't move against a household of this standing without you present, without your voice leading the accusation. He says it isn't his place to take this from you. The statement struck something deep in Sadie's chest. The simple fact that a king, with all the power to simply crush Henrik's family beneath his authority and call it justice, had chosen instead to wait for her, to ensure this victory belonged to her and not merely to him. She left that night through the same kitchen garden, Brynja guiding her past the sleeping household and into the tree line where horses waited in the dark. The ride back to Skarholt felt different from the desperate, friendless flight she'd planned only days before. This time she rode towards something rather than away from everything. Snow crunching beneath hooves, breath clouding in the bitter air. Her father's memory riding silent and steady beside her like an old promise finally being kept. Leander waited in the same antechamber where they'd first spoken honestly, but he wasn't alone this time. Several jarls stood near the brazier. Witnesses, she realized, gathered quietly enough that Henrik's family wouldn't yet know the trap had closed around them. Leander's eyes found hers the moment she entered, and something in his expression eased, as though some part of him had genuinely feared she wouldn't come. "You found everything," she said, holding out the fragment of burned letter alongside the documents Brynja had carried. "We found enough," he corrected gently. "The rest? You'll provide tomorrow, before the full council, in your own words. I won't take that from you, Sadie. This justice should belong to you, spoken with your own voice, not delivered second-hand by men who didn't bleed for it." She looked around the antechamber at the gathered jarls, at Brynja's steady presence near the door, at the king who had crossed half a frozen kingdom because his wolf refused to let him forget a debt owed to a dead man's daughter, and felt, for the first time since the armory shadows 3 nights before everything changed, something that wasn't fear at all. It felt, instead, dangerously close to hope. "Tomorrow, then," she said. "Let them hear all of it." Leander stepped closer, close enough that she caught the scent of pine and wood smoke that had become unexpectedly familiar in only a handful of days. "Tomorrow, Henrik and Gunhild answer for what they planned. And whatever happens after, whatever you decide about the bond, about me, you'll decide it as a woman with her inheritance restored and her father's name honored, not as a frightened girl with nothing left to lose." Sadie looked up at him, this king who spoke of choice as though it were sacred rather than inconvenient, and felt something in her chest settle into place. Not the fear she'd carried for 3 days, not even the grief she'd carried for 2 years, but something steadier, something that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like the beginning of solid ground beneath her feet. The council hall at Skarholt had never held this many jarls at once outside of war council. and Sadie felt every one of their eyes on her as she walked the length of the chamber the next morning, her spine straight. Despite the tremor, she refused to let reach her hands. Leander walked a half-step behind her, close enough to be present, far enough to make clear this was not his accusation to carry. Brynja stood near the side wall with the scribe Olaf beside her, pale but resolute, and beyond them, near the door, the fisherman Tormund shifted his weight from foot to foot, like a man who wished the floor would simply open and swallow him. Henrik and Gunhild had been summoned without explanation, told only that matters concerning the inheritance required clarification before witnesses. Sadie watched Henrik's face shift from confusion to wariness the moment he saw the gathered jarls, the documents laid upon the long table, Brynja's grim composure. Gunhild's expression gave away nothing at all, which told Sadie more than any flicker of fear could have. "This council is called," Leander said, his voice filling the hall without need of raising it, "to address a matter of inheritance fraud and conspiracy to murder, brought before me by Sadie, daughter of Eirik, against members of this household." The words landed like a stone through ice. Henrik's mouth opened, closed. Gunhild's spine went rigid. "This is absurd," Henrik managed. "My lord, whatever grievance has been—" "You will have your chance to speak," Leander said, not unkindly, but with finality that closed the matter entirely. "First, the lady will be heard." Sadie stepped forward. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice, when it came, did not shake. She told the council everything, the armory shadows 3 nights before the feast, Gunhild's voice describing an accident in the fjord, Henrik's laugh, the words, "She trusts me." That's the only blessing in this. She watched several jarls' faces harden as she spoke, watched old alliances calculate new costs in real time. When she finished, Olaf the scribe stepped forward, hands trembling as he unrolled the true inheritance documents, the hidden clause exposed at last, read aloud before the full council in language no one could dismiss as misunderstanding. Should the named bride perish within 1 year of the marriage's consecration, all lands, titles, and holdings of the Western Shore Pack transfer fully and irrevocably to Henrik, son of Bjorn, with no provision, dower, or claim reserved for any other party. A murmur swept the hall, low and furious. Several jarls who had daughters of marriageable age looked toward Henrik with open disgust. Tormund the fisherman spoke next, his testimony halting but damning. The coin paid to ensure a particular current pattern near the fjord cliffs would be understood. The second payment promised for spring. The explicit instruction that the accident needed to look natural enough that no one would think to question it. He produced the coin pouches as evidence, Gunhild's seal pressed clearly into the leather ties. By the time Brynja read aloud the charred fragment of Gunhild's letter, the broken girl's lands will finally serve the family properly, once the formalities conclude. Gunhild's careful composure had finally cracked, fury replacing the icy calm she'd worn into the hall. "You understand nothing," she spat, rounding on Sadie with a venom she could no longer disguise. "That land should have gone to true wolves generations ago. Your father held it only because the old laws favored bloodlines over strength. You were never meant to inherit anything, broken-blooded, unable to shift, unable to even claim a mate bond. We were simply correcting an old mistake." "Careful," Leander said, his voice dropping into something cold enough to silence the entire hall. "You stand before the council that decides whether you leave this room with your life intact, and you choose this moment to confess your reasoning aloud." Gunhild's mouth snapped shut, too late. Henrik, perhaps sensing the ground crumbling entirely beneath him, made one final desperate attempt. "I never agreed to harm her directly, whatever my stepmother planned. You said she trusts me. That's the only blessing in this," Sadie said quietly, and the words seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "I heard you, Henrik. I heard you laugh." He had no answer for that. None of the jarls expected one. The council's judgment, when it came after an hour of deliberation, was swift and absolute. Gunhild was stripped of all standing within the pack, her lands and holdings forfeit, exiled beyond the northern territories with the warning that any attempt to return would be met with death rather than further mercy. Henrik, judged complicit through silence and inheritance, scheming if not through direct violence, lost all claim to the western shorelands, his betrothal to Sadie dissolved with the full weight of council law, his name marked in the pack records as one whose word could no longer be trusted in matters of marriage or inheritance. He was permitted to remain within the territory, stripped of status, a humbled man with nothing left to inherit, and no one left who would trust him with anything of value again. It was not the bloody vengeance some dark corner of Sadie's grief had once imagined wanting. But watching Henrik's face crumble as everything he'd schemed for slipped away in a single morning, watching Gunhild marched from the hall in disgraced silence, Sadie understood that this, public, total, undeniable, was its own kind of justice. Not violence, truth, spoken aloud and believed. The western shorelands, by ancient rite and council confirmation, returned fully to Sadie, daughter of Eric, last of her father's line. In the days that followed, Sadie found herself standing in places she had never imagined claiming. At the head of her father's old hall, accepting the loyalty oaths of servants who had once looked through her as though she were furniture, walking the snow-dusted fields of land that was, for the first time in her life, entirely her own to govern. It should have felt triumphant. Mostly it felt strange. The particular disorientation of victory arriving after grief had already worn its groove so deep into her chest that she didn't quite know how to walk without it. Leander gave her space to feel that strangeness without rushing her toward anything else. He returned to Skarholt to handle matters of state, sending no demands, no expectations, only occasional messages carried by Brynja, word of how the council's judgment had been received across the northern territories. A question about whether the eastern boundary repairs Sadie had requested for her lands were proceeding well. Small kindnesses dressed as practical matters. It was 3 weeks before she saw him again. He arrived at her hall without ceremony, dismounting in the courtyard as snow began falling soft and steady around him. And Sadie found herself walking out to meet him before she'd fully decided to do so, her breath clouding in the cold air, her heart doing something complicated and unfamiliar at the sight of him. "You didn't send word," she said. "I wasn't certain I'd be welcome." He studied her face, searching for something. "I didn't want to arrive as a king collecting on a moon bond, Sadie. I wanted to arrive as a man, asking whether the woman who has spent 3 weeks rebuilding her father's lands with her own 2 hands has any room left in her life for someone who isn't required to be there." The honesty of it disarmed her more thoroughly than any grand declaration could have. She thought of the armory shadows, of Henrik's casual cruelty, of 2 years spent loving a man who had only ever wanted what her name could give him. She thought of this man instead, kneeling before her in a crowded hall, waiting 3 days without pressing his claim, insisting the justice belonged to her voice and not his power, asking now, quietly, whether he might simply be welcome. "My wolf still hasn't shifted," she said. "Whatever bond the moon marked between us, I still don't fully understand what I am." Leander. Broken-blooded, or simply unawakened. I don't know which. "Then we find out together," he said. "Or we don't. And it changes nothing about what I feel standing here. I didn't come for a wolf, Sadie. I came for the woman who refused a king in front of a packed hall, rather than trade one cage for another. That woman exists with or without a shift." Something in her chest, held tight and guarded since the night in the armory shadows, finally loosened. "Walk with me," she said, echoing his words from weeks before, and saw understanding bloom warm in his gray eyes. They walked the snow-dusted boundary of her father's lands as the light faded toward evening, talking of small things at first. The eastern repairs, a dispute between 2 of her tenant families that needed settling, Brynja's dry observation that Tormund the fisherman had taken up an honest trade, mending nets rather than risk further entanglement with conspiracies. Slowly, carefully, the conversation deepened into things neither had said aloud before. Her father's memory, the debt Leander had carried for 7 months, the particular loneliness of ruling alone, the particular loneliness of being thought broken by everyone who should have looked closer. By the time they reached the cliff overlooking the fjord, the same fjord that had once been meant to swallow her, now simply beautiful in the dying light, ice glittering gold and violet at the water's edge, something had settled between them that felt less like a bond imposed by Moon and more like a choice, deliberately made. "I'm not ready to be anyone's queen," Sadie said, watching the light fade over the water. "I've only just learned how to be the lady of my own hall. I don't know if I'll ever be ready for more than that." "Then I'll wait," Leander said. "Exactly as long as you need. I told you once I don't leave what's mine to die for someone else's greed. I meant it just as fully when I say I won't rush what's mine toward a future she isn't ready to choose for herself. And if I never choose it, if I simply want this, my lands, my hall, my own name standing on its own, then you'll have earned every bit of it," he said simply, "and I'll still be a man glad to have known you, whether as mate or simply as someone who chose her own life over every cage offered to her." There was no demand in it, no quiet pressure disguised as patience. Sadie studied him in the fading light, this Alpha King who had crossed a frozen kingdom for a debt owed to her father, who had kneeled before a hall of strangers and waited 3 days for trust he could have simply taken, who stood now offering her an open door rather than another set of walls, and felt something in her finally settle into certainty. "I don't want you to wait at a distance," she said. "I want to learn what this is, slowly, on my own ground, in my own time, but I don't want you gone while I learn it." A smile broke across his face then, the first full, unguarded smile she'd seen from him, transforming the controlled authority he wore like armor into something younger, something almost boyish in its relief. "Then I'll stay as close as you'll allow," he said, "and not a step closer." She reached for his hand the way she had in the firelit antechamber weeks before, and felt the same warmth bloom beneath her skin, the same stirring of something long asleep finally beginning, gently, to wake. He did not pull her closer. He simply held her hand in his, steady and warm, as the last light faded over the fjord, and the first stars emerged in the deepening violet sky. Spring came slowly to the northern fjords that year, the ice retreating in patient stages, the fields beneath the snow finally showing green at their edges. Sadie spent the season rebuilding what her father's death and Henrik's schemes had nearly destroyed, repairing boundary walls, restoring trust among tenant families who had watched her treated as nothing for 2 years, and now watched her govern with a steadiness that surprised even herself. Leander visited often, never staying longer than she invited, never asking for more than she offered. And somewhere in the slow accumulation of small visits and smaller kindnesses, Sadie found herself looking forward to the sound of his horse in her courtyard, with something that had stopped feeling like obligation entirely. Her wolf woke on a night in early spring, beneath a moon nearly full, with Leander beside her on the cliff overlooking the fjord. Not from any ritual or forced ceremony, but simply because, for the first time in her life, she felt safe enough in her own skin to stop holding everything so tightly closed. The shift came not as violence or struggle, but as something closer to relief, fur and bone reshaping beneath moonlight, while Leander knelt beside her, steady and unafraid, murmuring words of welcome to a wolf the healers had once declared could never exist. When she returned to herself, shaking and laughing and crying all at once, he wrapped his cloak around her shoulders and held her until the trembling stopped, and neither of them spoke of bonds or claims or destiny. There was no need. The choice had already been made, slowly and deliberately, across a winter and a spring, by a woman who had learned at last that love built on truth looked nothing like the cage she'd once mistaken for safety. She became his mate that summer, not through moon bond alone, but through deliberate choice spoken before both their peoples, lady of her father's western shorelands in her own right, mate to the AlphaKing by her own decision. A woman who had walked into a midwinter feast intending to vanish into the hills and walked out instead into a life entirely her own making. Henrik lived out his remaining years a quiet, diminished man on the edges of territory that had once nearly been his, watching from a distance as the broken-blooded girl he'd once dismissed as convenient became something he had never thought to imagine. Whole, powerful, and utterly beyond his reach. Gunhild was never heard from again beyond the northern border, her name spoken only as a cautionary tale told to young pack members about the cost of mistaking cruelty for strength. And Sadie, daughter of Eric, lady of the western shore, mate to Leander, AlphaKing of the northern packs, stood each midwinter after that first terrible feast at the head of her own hall, watching snow fall soft over land that was entirely, finally, hers, with a husband beside her who had crossed a frozen kingdom not to claim her, but simply to make certain she survived long enough to choose her own life. It was, in the end, exactly enough.